When you put data infrastructure in your title, you could expect that only the hardcore geeks are here, so welcome, welcome. But the interesting thing about this is that this is actually not a technical talk at all. So this is essentially talking about this journey of, yes, we need to build I need to build this HR analytic infrastructure. I need to build this functionality. But at the same time, what is this? This is a long-term project through big organizational change. If you don't already know, you'll learn what that big organizational change is maybe halfway through the presentation. Yeah, what happens is that when you're trying to build something and then the priorities change midway or the context changes, it's like you're trying to hit a moving target, and that can become really difficult, and you need to really think about how can I navigate this ambiguity and still provide something of value. But the thing is, at the same time, the modern business world and modern HR is constantly evolving. Like, there's never going to be this one outcome, and as the business evolves, we need to evolve ourselves along with our technical functionality, along with what we offer. So that's pretty much what this is about. And again, not technical talk, but if you are here and you want to see some technical things, you will be able to see a couple technical things on the slides here and there. A little bit about me. So I've been at GitHub for about 2 years now, and I am the sole people analytics person. So I identify as a crappy generalist, and that's how I feel most at home. So I handle all the things. We're about just over 1,000 people. And we're a high-tech company that helps programmers build cool things together. And my background is actually around industrial organizational psychology, but I've sort of been running away from that for a while, and you'll see that a little bit in this presentation where I did IO psychology and I started to learn more data science. And through this process, I started to get really into data engineering. So we'll see this going through. But before I actually start, I want to learn a little bit about all y'all. But this is sort of like a canned question, but who has had a long-term project in this space and then right after you make a proposal, there's big organizational change that comes through and then you need to do something else? Raise a hands. Like, definitely me. Like, that's happened not just this time, that's happened a few times. So it's really interesting to have to go through that entire process. Now, disclaimer, I'm going to be talking about some big things. All these are just my own opinions and my own views, not necessarily reflecting on my company. Acquisitions are always adventurous. That's all it is. So, getting into the presentation, the starting line. As we think about this modern HR space, we've heard it time and time again. All of y'all are here at this conference. You recognize that the modern HR professional isn't just, looking for an Excel sheet with tons of rows anymore. They're looking for these insights. They're looking for data that are fresh. And by fresh, I mean that data that have been updated in some regular way. They know exactly when these data are as of, and they can add that to their context when they're interpreting it. Beyond that, they want data that are clean, or I also like to use the word augmented. So that there's assumptions that are baked into those data that are consistent and that help them make a strategic decision based on this. Then finally, data that are explorable. So you can have a great, all-company dashboard, but if you can't filter down and dig deeper and try to find what exactly is happening here, then it's nice to know what's happening at the company overall, but that contrast between the company overall and maybe a local part of the company, like in sales, that can become very, very powerful. So overall, the back end of this context is that modern HR, as we all know, is becoming less administrative and more strategic, and analytics help serve that need. But when we don't have all of these data that are fresh, clean, and explorable, we're not setting up our HR partners to be successful with these data. So because of that, that's why it's so important. That's what I really set out to do when I joined GitHub. And when I joined GitHub, though, what was fun was that I actually interviewed for this. And as part of the interview process, I chatted about, okay, what's the current state? What's the current state? And I learned, oh yes, there's this nice relational database where you can drag and drop, you can put everything together, everything can be joined, it's all nice. We have, Workday, all these things, they all talk to each other. And I was so excited because I was coming from the social sciences, industrial organizational psychology background. I was so excited to jump into the data, to solve those problems, to look into, do research. It was so exciting. But then I learned that was a phantom database. It did not exist. There was no relationships between any of these systems. We might have our Human Resources Information System, HRIS. We have Workday. We have Greenhouse, which is our ATS, applicant tracking system, and Reflective, which is performance management, surveys, Culture Amp. None of those talk to each other whatsoever. So what was interesting is when I came into this role, now the person who chatted with me about this before, they actually thought that there was a SQL server somewhere, that all these things talk to each other nicely, but there was not. So that was a little bit of a change in context for me coming to this role, but I'm sure that many of us have had this experience of coming into a job and realizing I need to do different things than the things I was hired for. And that's a very natural piece, and we saw that even with MZ and all the skills development, being able to retrain the workforce, all of that nice stuff. Now, as I said, those systems were heavily siloed. They all existed in separate places. And then everywhere were manual Excel reports. People were pulling them. They were using different specifications when they were pulling these Excel reports. They didn't talk nicely to each other. If you wanted to bring two data sets together, you need to do they were doing a VLOOKUP or something like that in Excel. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of opportunities for manual errors to happen, for different assumptions to be baked in, for different answers to be reached. So this was a problem. And because of that, I viewed this as the biggest problem that I probably need to solve. But what's interesting, as I think about this journey, is that there's some people that I've heard in different places where they say, okay, you need to build up your data infrastructure first, you need to get all your data clean first, and then you can do the things. But my perspective is actually quite different in that, I think you can only build the credibility to make something long-term that's viable through doing the shorter-term solutions and building that credibility and actually being able to see what the organizational needs are. So what I really need to think about early on is, okay, yes, I know I need to build out this big analytics infrastructure and do this long-term need, but I also know there's a lot of due diligence I need to do. There's a lot of procurement. There's all those delays that many of us know. And because of that, I realized, wow, I want to build this thing in a setting, but I also need to create this shorter-term solution to give myself the runway in order to build that longer-term solution that I want. And that's essentially what I did. So here, I don't know how visible this is. Actually, it's not too bad. You see my little diagrams here. So what we can see on the, trying to think, this way it'll be on your left. This is the starting state. And as we can see, we have the Greenhouse, the Workday, the Reflective. All of them are getting separate Excel reports. And if you see the little, if you don't know, GitHub's mascot is a mix of an octopus and a cat. It's called an octocat. And if you see next to the little Excel logos, that's my own personal octocat. And it's looking rather grumpy. And it's looking rather grumpy because basically whenever I put that there, that means that there needs to be some human element. There's a very manual piece of, bringing that data, those data from Greenhouse to the final data consumer. So this is not ideal. We have these parallel paths that aren't talking to each other nicely. They're ending up at an end consumer. And in this case, it wasn't just me who was pulling the reports. There was other people who were pulling the reports. And there was inconsistencies across that entire process. And that's not ideal. So what I did is I created this interim solution. Again, this interim solution was not made to be this perfect, golden goose. It was made to give myself the runway and to get the credibility in order to build something longer term. So in this case, what we did was actually we started to use something called Jupyter Notebooks. So Jupyter Notebooks, if you're not familiar, it's notebooking software. You can write some Python code there. And I started to use it to actually, instead of doing the reports from Greenhouse or Workday, or rather Reflective, directly, I started to tap their APIs. Now, APIs are essentially places where you can ask a company or a database very nicely, like, can I have this data in this format? And if you do all the right things, they'll say, sure. So it happens programmatically. So you can write it into your little Python notebook, and then you can say, I would like this data. You run it, it gives it to you. Now, obviously you might start to think, okay, isn't that a little bit more complicated than running an Excel report? And the answer is yes. But what the benefit is that you can write this Python script, this Jupyter notebook once, and then any other time that you need to do this exact same thing, if you need to get the data, you need to restructure it, you need to create these different groups, you need to do all these things, you can make it happen the exact same way every single time you run it. And that was a benefit. That was a value add in this process to be able to add that consistency to what was happening after something was exported, where we were having inconsistent ways these were happening, via filters, via pivot tables, all those things via Excel. Now, the only interesting note here is that we were still using Excel for Workday because we didn't have the Workday APIs built out yet. So I'm being true to what was actually happening here, and we didn't actually have the Jupyter notebook. I still needed to actually pull the manual reports for that. But then afterwards, what actually happened was that after we do this programmatic way of getting it into the Jupyter notebook, it gets exported into a text file, and then it can be ingested by Tableau. Tableau, visual analytics software like Power BI or Visio or whatever. And what I was able to do is, similar to with the Jupyter notebooks, I was able to program assumptions into this dashboard to say, if I receive data with this file name and looking like this, then do all these things to it and make it very pretty. That's essentially what Tableau did, and again, it makes the same assumptions every single time, and that's what's valuable. But you can see, we see the little logo again for my little Octocat, and in this case it was always me, because I needed to manually send each exported image, because I was using Tableau Desktop, to the final data consumer, and that's what was happening. So, as you can see, we've added some more automatic nature here, but we still have some heavily manual elements that are not ideal. Now I get into the fun part, which is, I call it a sprint and a detour. So, we had some issues with the interim. So, if we look back over here, we see that we have from Greenhouse to Jupyter, and then Jupyter to Tableau, and then Tableau to the data consumers. Each time you see an arrow there, that's a manual file transfer done by me, and that's not ideal. What's interesting there is that there's lots of opportunities, even after I've added this automatic, script here for errors, for things to happen. Through this process, there's a lot of opportunity for a human error, and the biggest problem with that, I call it an interactive effect, is that I'm an extremely error-prone human. So this is extra bad for me because I'm not good at doing consistent processes. I'm good at building scripts and machines to do things consistently for me. So this was, I knew there was a little bit of a human exposure here, and in this case, I knew that this wasn't sustainable long term, but at the same time, even though it was manual, even though I knew there was opportunities for errors, I was able to build in error checks for that to make it, but still, it's not the best. So I started thinking about that longer term solution. I started thinking about that runway. And something that we hear about in the people analytics space is this whole idea of the one-stop shop. It can be, they tap into your Workday, they tap into your Reflective, they tap into everything, they bring them all together, and they create this nice relational database. And sometimes they'll just let you tap into that relational database directly, or they even build some visual analytics on top of that you can drag and drop, you can give to all your stakeholders, all really nice. So I chatted with a lot of these people, and I looked at a lot of products, and there's honestly a lot of great products out there for this. And there was actually one product that I became really interested in. I thought that I had a preference for actually just getting access to the relational database and then building my own thing on top of it. They were cool with that, and they had a lot of really great data engineering. I was happy when they were really great about my questions, so I was excited. So I built a really nice proposal, and it's probably actually one of the best proposals I ever wrote, and I was so excited, and I sent it to basically our CEO at the time, and then change happened. So about actually a couple days right after I sent that big proposal, that was my magnum opus, it was announced that Microsoft would be acquiring GitHub. So this is something that happened maybe a year or so ago. And this was a really interesting time for anyone who was at GitHub. When you hear about this, there's a lot of interesting feelings around, oh, what does this mean for myself? Well, am I going to keep my job? Is it going to be the same? What's going to be different for myself at this company? But then as you go through that process afterwards, you progress a little bit and you say, okay, I think that I'm maybe going to be okay, but then what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to our company? And when you think about it from a people analytics perspective, when we do people analytics, we build in assumptions and we serve needs and we reflect organizational context. And in this case, I had to realize that all of those, all that context and all that change, it's going to be different. And I had created this really nice solution that I was so excited for to a problem that might not be the same in a few months. And there, I decided after all that time to take a strategic rest because I realized that realistically, there's going to be a process, there's going to be a few months where I start to learn more about what this is actually going to look like. What are going to be the needs of this organization? What are going to be the new rules of engagement around this? And also, but what other cool things might be brought into the opportunity zone through this? But one thing I did do is that while I was taking this rest, is that I started to think, well, we're getting acquired by Microsoft, and Microsoft sort of does SQL and sort of created SQL. So maybe I should brush up on some of the tools on the actual back-end data engineering of SQL. So I started to explore. And I did very, not good, that's what I'll say, very terrible kind of setups. But I started to learn more about this data engineering, about oh, what is IP whitelisting? Well, IP whitelisting is something you need to do, or everything you try to do will fail and you won't know why until someone tells you. Because in data engineering, if you don't specifically whitelist an IP address, then it'll automatically fail and it won't tell you why, and it won't tell you why for a security reason. So for me, I started to start building this skill, started to think, and started to learn more and more about this organizational context as it went through. And then after that, what happened was that I started to feel comfortable. I started to think, okay, I've learned enough. We've had lots of great conversations. I understand what the needs of my organization are. They changed a little bit. But also, what was really exciting is that I realized that there's a lot of doors that were open through this. And I got help from a not so unexpected place because Microsoft has a very built out people analytics function. And they also have access to a lot of resources that honestly I didn't have before. So because of this, I was actually, I think Dawn's at this conference and she runs HRBI, or all of HR analytics at Microsoft. And she actually introduced me to a couple of her people who do their HRBI and all that. And I started to learn. And what was so useful about that for me is that as someone who runs their own people analytics function, I don't have too many people I can talk about these things with. And what was useful is they, opened up some routes for me. They said some places to explore, and I started to whip up some proposals and think about this data engineering. And it was so useful for me to be able to write someone and to say, I'm thinking I'm going to try this route. I'm going to try this. Am I insane? And they say, no, you're not insane. That actually sounds like it makes sense. And that was validating, and it helped give me the confidence that I could try out these things, that I could experiment with this data engineering, with this back-end data infrastructure without breaking GitHub, which happens across those different things. So that's where I started to go towards. And then I really started to have adventures with data pipelines. So I learned more about that SQL infrastructure and data engineering things when I was on my break, and I got help from Dawn's team at Microsoft. And I embarked on this exciting, though difficulty-prone journey with data pipelines because I started to learn, okay, I have a background as an analyst and data science. I'm used to working with a relational database. I'm not used to doing the data engineering. I'm not used to actually administering a database. That's an adventure. And I'm not used to thinking about even all of the legal infrastructure around these data pieces and data warehouses from GDPR, from other sources, all that. But what was really nice is that through these partners, I was able to keep on exploring. I was able to, start to build things progressively, and then, build out that functionality, which was very helpful for me. So then, here's my tentative solution that I ended up at, and I'll tell you about why I call it a tentative solution. So we have our data sources. That's again HRIS, ATS, and performance tool. And all of those via API end up in this place called Databricks. Now, Databricks is actually very, very similar to a Jupyter Notebook. The thing I like about Databricks is that essentially what you can do is that it's notebooking software that you can write this nice code, but it integrates very well with Spark and Scala, which happen to be languages that are very good for data engineering. And through that, you can also essentially tell it to do a job, and instead of running it manually yourself, you can put it on a schedule. And on that schedule, it'll pop up this little worker machine that'll do exactly what it's told to without you having to be there, and on a schedule, and then it just happens. And that was beautiful. And that's what I still use today. All that information is ingested into Databricks. I stage it there, I put it into its nice tables, and then I dump it into a SQL server. So at that SQL server, that's where it's warehoused, and then from there, it's ingested from Tableau, and then can be brought out to all my data consumers. And notice that I'm not showing those parallel lines anymore. So if you look back here, you see all these parallel lines. And here we see this convergence and this consistency, and then afterwards it's spread out again. So the Tableau in this case is actually Tableau Online. It's something where you can give everyone permissions. They get in there and they're able to get that same source of truth without my manual effort. The SQL Server, the Databricks, all those things are happening in a common place, which adds a lot of rigor to this process. And that's pretty much the tentative solution. And we see this contrast again with the starting state. What I'll move on to is why is this solution tentative? And through this process, something that I've really learned is that needs are always going to change. So I came into an organization, I was excited, I knew I needed to build this thing, and then I was forced to realize that there's realistic aspects of an organization that can change over time. And in this case, it was very located or specific in time around this acquisition. But a lot of other organizations, it's more progressive. It happens. But at the same time, when you have the change in need in an organization, doesn't it make sense to have the data infrastructure reflect that change in need? And similarly, there can be changes in laws. We have GDPR that's been happening, and then even if you're here in California, there's the new CCPA. There's so many new directives around that, and that if you don't update your infrastructure to do so, you're putting yourself in some real legal hot water. And obviously you want to keep yourself out of that, especially as an HR function, that you should be good at that. And then finally, changing assumptions. This is something that I believe a lot in, is that when we build out data solutions in people analytics, we're making small assumptions. We're saying things like, okay, I know that past this date in my data that there was this little integrity issue, like maybe interns were coded as full-time employees. And it's fine, you know that. But also there might be other things like, when we have a contingent worker, they're probably a contractor. But as the organization evolves, that can change. Like for example, we have at GitHub a new model for a contingent worker that's some Microsoft people who are helping us out. And that's incredibly useful, and we didn't have that before. We had no need for that, but now we do, and that actually changes the assumptions we need to make in our data models to serve out these analytics. And I guess through this entire process, I've realized, even though it happened in a big way in this case, it's always going to happen progressively, and that as analysts, we need to make sure we're serving those needs through continually investing. So I'm really motivated right now to get y'all to lunch a little bit early, so that's where you see this, but I'm going to get into some reflection. So some key themes. The only constant is change, especially around analytics, infrastructure, and even earlier we were talking about cybersecurity. You know, how vulnerable your infrastructure is to cybersecurity threats changes even, I'd say, even on a monthly basis. Like if you find that you're out of, you know, the right version of your database, then you can actually run into big issues even after one little incident around that. The next thing is that new capabilities are not destinations. So I had this whole race thing. It's like there's no finish line in this case, especially for HR analytics infrastructure. So when I started out, again, I thought that it would all be nicely built out and I'd be able to have all my fun doing my analytics. And what I realized over time is that this is not a place I get to and then I get to do all the fun things. This needs to be a continuous investment because when you do that investment, you're able to unlock new opportunities and make sure that you're still serving your stakeholders in the best possible way. And I think it's just mentally it's useful to think about it. If you keep on thinking about it as a destination, as this finish line, and then you get delays, you get changing context, you get things that happen, it's just more difficult that way when you get those setbacks. But if you think about it in terms of a journey and that things are going to happen in a modern organization, in the modern world, to be a little bit more resilient around that and think about it as this process. Another thing that I believe very strongly in is that I skipped a lot of things here and that, there was a whole year there where I was using this short-term solution. And that short-term solution gave me that breathing room to not have to, create something non-ideal in a very short amount of time that's supposed to be this final data infrastructure. Instead, I was able to create something that was known to be interim, that took a lot of the manual effort out, but not all, but then gave that runway in order to actually be very thoughtful about building something longer term. And that became extra useful when we had a big change in organizational context and we keep on relying on that interim solution. And then finally, owning your own infrastructure is actually kind of beautiful. So I think there's a differentiation. Some people analytics functions own their own infrastructure, some don't. I'm a big proponent of owning it, but that's just because of how I'm wired. But the thing is, if you are just working out of a SQL database that's already been made for you, that's great. And you can have great partners to help set that up for you. But how I think about it now is that if we actually go back to this entire process, whereas most people, they just have the opportunity to play around at Tableau or maybe even the SQL server about where the data actually come from. Whereas for me, when I'm problem solving, when I'm trying to build out new functionality, I can do a solution actually myself at the Workday level. I can create a new calculated field. I can do it at the Databricks level. I can use R, I can use Python, I can use Scala to solve this. I can do this at the SQL level in the SQL server, and I can also do it at the Tableau level, where I can create a new grouping or a new parameter or something like that. And that flexibility opens up a lot of functionality that I find a lot of peers that I chat with don't enjoy. So that's when you actually own this data infrastructure. Sure, you can have these partners and they can be great. They can set up new things, but even through that, there's always this game of telephone. There's inefficiencies through the communication that's obviously not 100%, and it can add a lot of delays, a lot of extra issues, that kind of thing. So that's where, just selfishly, and since I've enjoyed this, that I think that owning your own infrastructure is very beautiful. And for myself, I didn't start from a place where I thought that I'd be starting to do data engineering. But as I started to go through it, I started to realize that it's actually something that's fairly accessible once you already know some data science, and that you can just go progressively and you learn about it and can be incredibly helpful. So if you have an interest in that, definitely don't sell yourself short. It's not this magical thing. That's what the engineers will try to tell you. It really isn't, and you can have your adventures. And that is my presentation. So there you go. Happy to take any questions this time.
So you mentioned there could be organizational changes happening all the time. So one of the challenge I see is business partners, they ask for a view of their organization as of today. but looking at historical data. How do you tackle that?
Okay, cool. Yeah, so organizational change, even, so if you're saying I want to see my workforce as of date X or something like that, I actually have two separate solutions for that. One is that whenever I do a data engineering flow, because I actually own my own infrastructure, every single time I do that dump into a database, I have a separate database that I put a backup into. So at any time, I can go back to that those old data from any specified date where I did an ETL run, or sorry, that's extract, transfer, and load. It's just data pipelines. And essentially from there, I can bring back that data. So that's one way. Second way is to essentially go back to, I actually use Tableau, and I can do calculated fields with dates and parameters to basically say, what was your status during this time period? So I can say, okay, we have a hire date, we have an end date, or a termination date, we have promotion dates, we have all these things. And what you can do is you can create new recalculated fields in order to basically recalculate where someone was. Now, those two solutions might differ in certain cases. Now, where will they differ? It's that if for whatever reason they went back in time and they backdated something for whatever reason, that could create a difference. But I think what I'm trying to highlight is that when you own multiple pieces of this flow, you get more flexibility in that problem solving in order to do that. Does that answer your question?
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm a People and Culture Data Analyst at MindBody. Thank you for your presentation. We have a lot of similarities. I'm also an IO grad. Got hired on as an insights analyst, but we're so new to people and culture data. We don't have any sort of infrastructure. So I'm realizing that data engineering, data warehousing, data administration is really what needs to come first. Do you have any recommendations on, you spoke to your network and that was able to help you get your skills with data science. Do you have any other recommendations elsewhere, more formal training programs or things like that for data engineering?
Yeah, so I don't have too many of those because I'm more of a self-taught person. I think that if you are someone that, if you don't have familiarity with APIs, I think there's a lot of great places where you can learn about that. There's websites like DataCamp or Udemy. They have these great things you can just say how to use an API. And that's actually often the foundation of doing this data engineering, to work with an API. Once you get into database administration, I actually don't know a great place to learn about that. I learned through the School of Hard Knocks, and that's where IP whitelisting really hurt me. But I think that what I'm trying to say overall is that I even viewed this as this crazy and wondrous thing that I'd never be able to do myself, coming from my social science background. But when you go through progressive, you learn it's all a set of simple rules that are like basically if-then statements that you can go through, you can understand, and you can build out these flows. So I do recommend DataCamp. I do recommend, there's some stuff on Udemy and Coursera around it. Keywords would be things like data pipelines, APIs, and even what's it called? ETL, which is again that extract, transform, and load. It's not a great it's not a great acronym. And then finally, if you look me up on LinkedIn, I have a separate talk where I talk about dealing with web scraping, which gets into some very similar skill sets as you use when you're working with APIs.
Thank you.
Jared, thanks for your talk. Appreciate it. Sounds like you have a Udemy course in the works yourself that you can maybe leverage in the future. So as a possible side gig. It was very informative to see the tech stack that you're working with and how you built it from the ground up, and how it lends you a lot of configuration capabilities that other people analytics team don't really have because they don't own the infrastructure. But my question, being GitHub, I was wondering what role version control systems have in your toolkit or your infrastructure. And I know being a team of one, it might not play a big role now, but as you look into the future, my team right now, we're kind of facing the challenge of everybody's latest version of their query, of their analysis, living on their local machine, and getting that pushed to some shared file or file system so we can update and understand and be on the same page. I'm just wondering where GitHub plays in your GitHub people analytics tech stack.
Yeah, so as you anticipated, I'm a team of one, and I don't have too much use for version control. I have version 1 or version 2 in my stack. I don't need to put it on GitHub. But for those who don't know, I describe GitHub as a collaboration platform for programmers. That's true. Version controlling, think about it as something like the history or revisions or track changes in Microsoft Word or something like that. It's being able to go back to how you wrote a piece of code before maybe it breaks and go back to that and see what works, what doesn't. So that's what we're getting into here. So I don't use GitHub for that use, but I know that a lot of data pipelining teams do use GitHub. They'll be able to write their little Python script or whatever up into this. They might change and edit one little piece and they can see it. You can see that as a diff. You can do a pull request. These are all weird GitHub terms. But that's definitely useful. But actually from my perspective, where I've used GitHub in my tech stack is that, and our friends at MZ would love this. We actually have the biggest database in the world probably of programmers doing things. And programmers doing things around the world because we're an open source product as well. So actually, on occasion, what I've done is I've actually gone into our databases to find aggregate data around different local areas that have certain programming skills that we're looking for. Like let's say if we're looking for C++, who's doing C++ at a high level? We can actually look into those nested labor markets and find exactly where it is. That isn't actually self-reported. It's actually people who are doing things in GitHub. So I know that when it's a little bit of a separate route there, but that's one way I actually do use GitHub in order to expand this work. Okay.
Hi. So sounds like, do you think most of your work is fairly descriptive as opposed to more of the kind of more predictive aspects right now? And are you going into that direction at all?
Yeah, I have a whole talk about that. What's interesting is that, especially when we're an organization going through big change, what are we doing when we're doing predictive analytics? We're essentially copy-pasting the past into the future. And sometimes that context very much changes. And from my perspective, after the acquisition happened, I actually had built a nice turnover model that I was super excited about. It was working very well. And I was about to present it to our executives, and I went up to them afterwards and I said, I built this thing, we should never use it. Because the context had changed. The reasons that people leave an organization before an acquisition are very different than the reasons they leave after an acquisition. So I think that in my world, we still have some organizational change that's ongoing. We see some stability in some elements, like I think I can predict certain levels of turnover, but at the same time, whenever I have this big organizational change, I'm extremely reticent and going to be critical of predictive analytics because in a lot of cases, the past doesn't reflect the present or the future that we're going towards. And what I do often is I'll make these calls and then I'll cross-validate. I'll say, I don't think this will work, but then 6 months later, let's see if it would have worked. Atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. Before it'd be like R squared value, or you'd be able to predict at 50%, and then it goes down to 10 or something like that. So because of that, that's where I do a lot of descriptive work because that's even the place we're at. We're very foundational. I do some predictive once in a while, but I'm very concerned about using predictive analytics when there's major organizational change.